In most 1950s neighborhoods, a woman who hung her laundry out after 9 in the morning was quietly judged by every neighbor who happened to notice. Not one of them would say so directly. No one would knock on her door and mention it. No meeting was called. No rule was posted anywhere. It simply existed, understood by everyone, enforced by no one, and felt by the woman standing at her own clothesline with a basket of wet sheets and a growing awareness that someone, somewhere nearby, had already noticed the time. In the 1950s, the most powerful rules governing a woman's life were never written down at all. They lived in the spaces between conversations, in the glances exchanged after church, in the things nobody ever said out loud but everyone understood completely. Today, the 10 secret rules 1950s women lived by. The ones nobody talked about, but nobody needed to. Item number 1. The laundry timing rule. The clothesline was one of the most visible surfaces of a 1950s woman's domestic life, and everything about it was red. The time the laundry went out was the first signal. Sheets and clothing hanging by 8 or 8:30 in the morning suggested an early, well-ordered start to the day. Past 9, and a neighbor's glance carried a slightly different quality. Past 10, and the interpretation had already quietly shifted towards something less flattering. Beyond timing, the neatness of the line-matted items hung straight and evenly spaced suggested a woman in control of her household. Bunched or crooked items suggested otherwise. The order things were hung in could carry meaning to. In communities where women had spent enough mornings observing each other's lines to develop an entire unspoken vocabulary around what a clothesline, read correctly, could tell you about the woman behind it. Item number 2. The smile obligation. A woman seen in public with anything less than a composed, pleasant expression risked a specific and damaging interpretation. Not that she was tired, not that she was having a difficult morning, but that something was wrong in her marriage. The public smile wasn't simply encouraged as good manners. It functioned as active proof of a well-ordered domestic life, a visible signal that her husband was providing adequately, that her household was running smoothly, and that she was content in her role. A woman who looked visibly sad, or simply neutral in the wrong context, reflected on her husband's competence as much as her own. The smile was, in this sense, less a personal expression and more a piece of social communication directed at an entire community that was, whether she acknowledged it or not, always watching and always drawing conclusions. Item number 3. The neighbor visit code. Dropping by a neighbor's home in the 1950s wasn't the casual, spontaneous act it might appear. It carried an entire unspoken protocol that both parties understood without it ever being discussed. The time of day you visited mattered. A morning visit implied a level of familiarity and social ease, while an evening visit without prior arrangement could feel presumptuous. How long you stayed was noted, whether you accepted food or drink when offered, and how graciously was observed. Visiting a particular neighbor too frequently could mark you as lonely, or worse, as someone who pried. Not visiting enough marked you as cold, antisocial, or quietly disapproving. A woman navigated this invisible social map every time she walked out her front door, calibrating her behavior against an unwritten standard that no one had ever explained to her directly, because no one needed to. Item number 4. The good wife performance rule. A wife was expected to present her marriage as happy and her husband as capable, regardless of what was actually happening behind their front door. This wasn't considered dishonesty. It was considered basic dignity, the appropriate protection of a household's private affairs from outside judgment. Admitting marital difficulty to a friend, acknowledging financial strain to a neighbor, or expressing genuine unhappiness about her circumstances to anyone outside the immediate family was considered a serious social transgression, a public exposure of what should have remained private, and a kind of disloyalty that once noted was rarely entirely forgotten. It meant that for millions of women, the one place they might have found support, their own social world, was also the place that required them to perform most convincingly. The performance wasn't optional, and the audience never went home. Item number 5. The appearance maintenance signal. A woman's appearance in the 1950s was never read as simply personal. It was read as financial. A missed hairstyle appointment, a dress that was visibly outdated, shoes that had seen too many seasons without replacement. None of these were interpreted as individual circumstance or simple personal preference. They were read as evidence. A woman who looked less than well maintained in public was quietly understood to be signaling one of two things. Either her husband wasn't providing adequately, or she wasn't managing what he provided with sufficient care. Neither interpretation reflected well on the household. This meant that a woman experiencing genuine financial difficulty faced a particular, invisible pressure to maintain the appearance of a household that was managing perfectly well, using resources that were already stretched, because the alternative was a public admission of struggle that carried its own lasting social cost. Item number 6. The Ambition Concealment Rule. A woman with genuine professional ambitions, serious intellectual interests, or opinions that extended meaningfully beyond her domestic role was generally expected to manage those qualities carefully in social settings, downplaying them, redirecting them, or simply keeping them private. For a single woman, being seen as too opinionated or too career-focused raised quiet questions about
her marriageability,
suggesting she might be difficult to live with or unwilling to subordinate her own priorities to a household's needs. For a married woman, the same qualities carried a different but equally limiting interpretation: that she was somehow dissatisfied with what she had, ungrateful for a husband and home that should, by the era's accounting, have been more than enough. Real intellectual ambition didn't disappear in these women. It went underground, expressed in private reading, in quiet conversations with trusted friends, in the careful management of a public self that bore only partial resemblance to the private one. Item number 7. The Children as Proof Rule. In the social arithmetic of a 1950s community, a woman's children were understood as the most visible evidence of her domestic competence. Their behavior in public, their appearance, the quality of their manners when observed by neighbors, teachers, or other families, all of it was read as a direct reflection of how well their mother was managing her household and fulfilling her primary role. A child who misbehaved publicly wasn't simply an embarrassing moment. It was a public indictment, quietly registered and quietly remembered by everyone who witnessed it. This placed a specific, exhausting pressure on mothers in any shared social space: a church service, a grocery store, a neighborhood gathering, where managing a child's behavior was simultaneously a domestic task and a public performance with real social consequences attached to every outcome. Item number 8. The Emotional Containment Rule. Expressing strong negative emotions in any public or semi-public context was considered genuinely unseemly for a woman of good standing in this era. Anger was perhaps the most dangerous. A woman who expressed it openly risked being labeled difficult, unstable, or impossible to live with, regardless of whether her anger was entirely reasonable. But the rule extended beyond anger. Prolonged visible grief, open frustration, or any emotional expression that exceeded what the community considered a socially acceptable window of feeling, could invite the same quiet reclassification. Women were expected to process difficulty privately and present composure publicly, not as a personal aspiration but as a social requirement. Those who struggled to maintain this standard were sometimes labeled as unstable by the very communities they depended on for support, a particularly isolating outcome given that the rule itself made seeking that support nearly impossible in the first place. Item number 9. The Husband Defense Rule. A wife was expected to defend her husband's decisions and protect his reputation in any public or semi-public setting, regardless of her private position on either. This went considerably beyond simple loyalty. It meant that a woman who privately disagreed with a financial decision her husband had made, or who had her own view on a community matter he'd taken a public stance on, was expected to present a unified front that aligned with his position, not because she'd been asked to, but because the alternative carried real social risk for both of them. A wife who openly criticized her husband, even mildly, to neighbors or friends, was understood to be undermining his standing in the community in a way that reflected on her own judgment and loyalty simultaneously. The rule meant that a woman's private opinions on her own marriage, her own household, and her own life were, in a meaningful sense, not entirely her own to express, at least not anywhere they might be overheard. Item number 10. The Contentment Performance. The last rule was also the most pervasive, and in many ways the one that held all the others in place. A woman was expected to perform contentment, not just to her husband in private moments, but to her entire social world, consistently and convincingly, regardless of what she actually felt underneath that performance. Contentment with her role, contentment with her circumstances, contentment with a life whose shape had been largely determined before she was old enough to have meaningfully chosen it. This wasn't simply social pressure to be cheerful, it was a comprehensive requirement to present a specific version of herself, grateful, fulfilled, and quietly satisfied as the only acceptable public face of a 1950s wife and mother. Betty Friedan would later describe what lay beneath this performance as the problem that has no name, a persistent, unspoken dissatisfaction that millions of women had been privately living with for years, unable to name it, unable to discuss it, because the rule itself required that it remain unspoken. By the early 1960s, these unspoken rules began cracking, not from the outside, but from the inside. What changed first wasn't legislation or formal protest, it was language. In 1963, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique gave words to a private experience that millions of women had been required to perform their way around for years, describing in plain terms a dissatisfaction so widespread and so carefully suppressed that most of the women experiencing it had assumed, in their isolation, that they were experiencing it alone. The significance of that moment wasn't primarily legal. We've covered the legal changes in a separate video. It was something quieter and in some ways more fundamental. Women began naming these rules to each other, and the act of naming them was itself a direct challenge to the silence the rules had always depended on to survive. What's worth sitting with, looking back at all of this, is how completely invisible these rules were, and how real their consequences were despite that invisibility. No one enforced the laundry timing rule with any formal authority. No one issued a penalty for a missed smile, or a moment of visible frustration, or an ambition expressed too openly in the wrong company. The enforcement was entirely social, distributed across an entire community of people who had each absorbed the same rules, so thoroughly that they applied them automatically, without conscious decision, often without even recognizing what they were doing. That's what made these rules so durable, and so difficult to simply walk away from. They weren't imposed from above. They were woven into the texture of ordinary daily life, in a neighbor's glance at a clothesline, in a smile held a beat longer than it was genuinely felt, in the careful, constant performance of a contentment that was never quite as complete as it looked from the outside. Did your mother or grandmother ever let one of these rules slip, a moment when the performance cracked slightly, or a confidence shared in private that she'd never have said out loud in company? Those are exactly the kinds of stories worth preserving. Tell us in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this look back, you'll want to see this next one just as unforgettable, waiting right here.